From the first king of all England in 927, Athelstan, grandson of Alfred the Great, to his distant kinsman, King Charles III, there have been 6 separate years in English and British history where more than 2 monarchs, crowned or uncrowned, ruled or were proclaimed in a single calendar year. There are other instances of the same in principle, except that the monarch returns. Such as in Scotland, 1094. Donald III reigned, with Duncan II winning the throne from his uncle for just 195 days before being killed in an ambush, and Donald regained the empty throne. 924. Alfred was elected King of Wessex for 16 days. Edward the Elder, King of Wessex, was the son and successor of Alfred the Great, ruling from 899 until his death in 924. Having militarily reconquered the Viking Danelaw from 911 to 918 in alliance with his formidable sister, Athelflaed, and her Mercian army. By 3 wives, he had 10 children, 5 of which were sons. The oldest was Athelstan, whom Edward had placed with his sister Athelflaed to raise at her Mercian court, possibly with the intention of him being a sub-king there. He would appease the restless Mercian alliance as a political pawn, as both Athelflaed and hers and Edward's own mother had also been. Alfred was the younger half-brother of Athelstan by Edward's second wife, whom the Wessex nobles chose as Edward's successor, but the Mercian nobles chose Athelstan as their preference in rivalry. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that Alfred died only 16 days after his father, July the 17th, that he was buried at Winchester, and the West Saxons then chose Edwin, Alfred's brother. There seems to have been an increased tension between the 2 allied kingdoms during this time. After Alfred's death, Athelstan narrowly avoided a plot to capture and blind him whilst at Winchester. Some of the West Saxon nobility did object to Athelstan, as recorded by William of Malmesbury, the foremost English historian of the 12th century, who wrote that there was a conspiracy. The conspiracy was based on the baseless assertion that Athelstan was illegitimate, the son of a concubine. His mother, Egwin, was an illustrious lady, but there were salacious stories that she and Athelstan's father, Edward, were not married, and that she was a shepherd's daughter. This suggests that there may have been a faction, based perhaps at Winchester, which favoured the accession of Alfred's brother Edwin after Alfred's death in August 924. The only document of Athelstan's reign witnessed by Edwin is a charter of the new Minster of Winchester, granting lands to one Alfred, a thegn of King Athelstan. Edwin witnesses the charter immediately after his half-brother and is described as Atheling, which may strengthen the case that support for Alfred and Edwin was based at Winchester. Edwin lived on until 933, when he was driven abroad by unknown troubles in the kingdom, possibly plots or revolts against his reigning half-brother again, and died at sea. Later legend suggested that Athelstan was somehow to blame. Simeon of Durham, 12th century English chronicler and a monk of Durham Priory, stated that King Aethelstan commanded that his brother Edwin be drowned at sea. But the truth will never be confirmed. The Mercians elected Athelstan in a lavish ceremony attended by Mercian bishops and magnates. This prince was, after all, the oldest and most experienced warrior amongst Edward's sons, but it wasn't until summer 925 that the Wessex nobles supported Athelstan, and he was finally crowned king. The first of all England. He would go on to shatter a huge Viking and Scottish army in 937 at the colossal Battle of Brunanburh, near York, ensuring that England survived. 1016. Edmund Ironside ruled for 221 days. Ethelred the Unready had misruled disastrously for nearly 4 decades under successive waves of ferocious Viking invasions, and their violent attacks upon his unhappy people, as well as severe famines that ravaged the land. Danish King Sweyn Forkbeard, father of Canute, won the English throne in late 1014 but died after only 40 days, and the English royal family returned from exile in Normandy, Ethelred's wife Emma's birthplace, to rule again. Everything that could go wrong in his reign had. Ethelred wasn't stupid or a coward, but he could never get anything right, made bad decisions, was impulsively cruel, chose advisors poorly and always listened to the wrong advice. Upon his unmourned death on St. George's Day, his son Edmund succeeded him, very different in nature to his father, earning the nickname Ironside for his bravery in battle against the Vikings and reviving English spirits. He raised several armies this year and launched successful cat-and-mouse campaigns against the Vikings, led by Canute, winning 5 incredible victories. After suffering so many miserable decades of privations, the English dared to believe that, with the Viking army now being beaten, pursued and pushed back under the dynamic leadership of their new king, they might return to the glory days of Alfred the Great. But sadly it was not to be. On October the 18th, Canute and his army had their backs to the wall at Ashingen, Hill of Ash Trees, before they could escape by sea and, with Edmund's men of Wessex and Mercia facing him, battle was joined in a climactic showdown. The fighting was bitter and merciless, but suddenly, the Mercian Earl, Edric Strona, ever the traitor changing sides, abandoned his king and led his Mercian troops from the field, leaving his kinsmen to their doom. The English fought on bravely, but were surrounded as the day grew long. By dusk, the flower of England had fallen that October day, so grievous were the losses. Edmund and some retainers had managed to escape the slaughter and withdraw to Deerhurst, possibly to regroup and raise yet another exhausted army. Here he and Canute met, sought peace as sworn brothers and agreed to divide the kingdom. But Edmund died of wounds within days. Canute then became the sole crowned king of England, starting his reign with a violent purge of many of the surviving English nobility. In a strange quirk of history, it was almost exactly 50 years to the day before the Battle of Hastings. Foreign invaders had fought a powerful English army, with war tricks involved, and defeated them after an all-day bloodbath that changed England forever. 1066, King Harold Godwinson ruled for 282 days. Half-Norman Edward the Confessor had ruled peacefully since 1042, having married Edith Godwinson, the beautiful daughter of his mightiest earl, Godwin of Wessex, who died in 1053, whom he hated and blamed for the blinding and death of his own brother Arthur in 1036. But their marriage had never produced children and, to offset his fractious relationship with Godwin, had offered the future succession of the throne of England to a powerful distant kinsman, the young Duke William of Normandy in 1051. This promise, should Edward never sire his own issue, the Normans took extremely seriously, even though there are indications that even by 1060 Edward might have been considering other contenders. He had also made the same rash promises to the Danes and the Norse in the 1040s. Harold of Wessex, Godwin's eldest surviving son whom the old king liked, was England's most powerful earl, a loyal ambassador and an experienced warrior. In 1064 though, he had found himself shipwrecked and trapped in Normandy whilst on a personal mission, having fallen into the hands of the fearsome Norman duke, swearing an oath to William to support his own claim to the English throne. This was over hidden relics, the Normans admitted. But England's Witan, a powerful council of nobles and clerics, thought that an enforced oath outside of England was invalid. If William was still hopeful that Edward was going to leave him his kingdom, one wonders why, in 1063, the Norman duke would poison to death Edward's own nephew, Walter of Morn, who had been held in his jail. When the ailing King Edward died in early January aged 63, the Witan elected Harold as king. The true king via lineage was really Edgar Atheling, grandson of Edmund Ironside, but he was a boy of 14 and nowhere near experienced enough to face ferocious invaders such as the Danes, the Norwegians or the Normans. However, he was proclaimed king by the Witan on October 15, the day after news of the disastrous battle at Hastings, but the Witan collapsed in the face of the advancing Norman army by December. This bypassing of princes in dire times was accepted in Anglo-Saxon society. Alfred the Great had done the same upon his accession in 871. Now was not the time for weakness or indecision. At least 3 mighty warlords wanted to invade England and seize the crown by force. King Harold raised a general feared and his elite housecarl warriors, the SAS of their day, and positioned his army along the south coast to watch for the Norman fleet. The Norman Duke was out hunting when fearful heralds dared to deliver the disastrous news from England. 1483, Edward V was an uncrowned king for 78 days. Set against the backdrop of the brutal Wars of the Roses, then called the Cousins' Wars, Yorkist warrior King Edward IV ruled England from 1461 following his stunning, but bitterly won victory at the Battle of Towton, the bloodiest battle ever fought in Britain. The throne changed hands 7 times in this bloody period. Heralds recorded that, from a total of over 50,000 men who fought in that bitter snowstorm and the merciless rout as the Lancastrians finally broke, 28,000 lay dead. Edward, in addition to his martial prowess on the field, was a hedonistic king, collected fine clothes, jewels, history, classical books, and really enjoyed heavy drinking and womanizing. He was also unable to take good advice and ignored the sound political and marital plans of his ally and father figure, Earl Warwick the Kingmaker, and impulsively married a commoner, Elizabeth Woodville. Her ambitious family quickly rose to high office but were hated by many nobles, including Edward's own loyal younger brother, Richard. These factors were the causes of the catastrophe to come. All of his vices were ultimately Edward's downfall, medically and literally. We do not know what caused his sudden death in 1483, some said poison, which was a common medieval accusation, but a contemporary attributed it to apoplexy brought on by excess, which fits with what is known of his physical habits. Edward also failed to safely secure the futures of his 2 young sons, Richard and the older brother who would have been crowned Edward V. The Woodvilles now controlled the navy, treasury, and privy council. They and Edward's younger brother Richard vied bitterly for power, using the young princes as political pawns in a lethal game. Within months, both boys would be murdered. In Edward's will, his younger brother Richard was named protector of the realm. Arrangements were made for the 12-year-old Prince Edward's coronation on the 22nd of June 1483. Before he could be crowned, the marriage of his parents was declared bigamous and therefore invalid. Now officially illegitimate, their children were barred from inheriting the throne. On the 25th of June, an assembly of lords and commoners endorsed a declaration to this effect, and proclaimed Richard as the rightful king, who was crowned on the 6th of July 1483. Just 3 days later he dismisses the prince's servants from the Tower. He had many of the Woodvilles jailed or executed, whilst the young princes were both held in the royal residences of the Tower. In the summer, they were often seen at the windows, but in August, they were seen less and less. Finally, not at all. Scandal gossip rounded London and suspicions of Richard's complicity grew. Richard was not the true king, revolts threatened, and he stationed 6,000 troops around London to secure the town. In October 1483, an unsuccessful revolt was led by staunch Yorkist allies of Edward IV and Richard's former henchman, Henry Stafford, 2nd Duke of Buckingham, who now possibly suspected his master of the murders. They were possibly also in league with their former Lancastrian enemies who were principally Henry Tudor, later King Henry VII, and his zealously ambitious mother Margaret Beaufort, ever prepared to do anything it took to get her beloved son on the throne. But the plot fails, and Buckingham is executed. It is possible that they planned to depose Richard and place Prince Edward on the throne, already grieving the loss of Anthony Woodville, 2nd Earl Rivers, his father figure, and that when rumors arose that Edward and his brother were dead, Henry Tudor should return from exile, take the throne and marry Elizabeth of York, Edward IV's daughter and older sister of the Tower Princes. Richard was to face a showdown of his enemies in August 1485 at Bosworth, where he would be killed, and the same year, his enemy, Henry, crowned as king. Did Richard III order the ghastly deed, even though the boy's own mother, Elizabeth Woodville, oddly never blamed him? Or did other culprits kill the doomed boys, like Buckingham, or the Lancastrian Tudor factions? 1553, Lady Jane Grey was proclaimed as Queen for 9 days in July. Edward VI was always a boy of ill health, the beloved son of Henry VIII and his beloved third wife, Jane Seymour. He succeeded his father in 1547 aged 9 and inherited a bankrupt nation, but, because he never reached maturity, the realm was governed by a regency council, first by his uncle Edward Seymour, 1st Duke of Somerset, and then by John Dudley, 1st Earl of Warwick. The reign was beset by economic problems, an expensive but successful war with Scotland and social unrest that led to an anti-Catholic rebellion in 1549. It was during Edward's reign that Protestantism was established for the first time in England with reforms that included the abolition of clerical celibacy and the Mass, and the imposition of compulsory services in English. Edward fell ill with fever in early 1553. When his sickness was discovered to be terminal as he wasted away, he and his council drew up a devise for the succession, to prevent the country's return to Catholicism. Edward named his first cousin once removed, Lady Jane Grey, as his heir, excluding his older half-sisters, Mary, a fervent Catholic, and Elizabeth, a devout Protestant. Lady Jane Grey was the great-granddaughter of Henry VII through his younger daughter Mary. She had an excellent reputation as one of the most learned young women of her day. In May 1553, she married Lord Guildford Dudley, a younger son of Edward's chief minister John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland. Princess Mary was kept informed about the state of her half-brother's health by Northumberland and through her contacts with the imperial ambassadors. Aware of Edward's imminent death, she sped to her estates in Norfolk, where she could count on the support of her tenants. Northumberland sent ships to the Norfolk coast to prevent her escape or the arrival of reinforcements from the continent. He delayed the announcement of the king's death on July 6 while he gathered his forces, and on the 10th of July his new daughter-in-law Jane was proclaimed queen in the streets of London, to murmurings of discontent. The Privy Council received a message from Mary asserting her right and title to the throne and commanding that the council proclaim her queen, as she had already proclaimed herself. The council replied that Jane Grey was queen by Edward's authority and that Mary, by contrast, was illegitimate and supported only by a few lewd, base people. Ouch! Northumberland soon realized that he had miscalculated drastically. Although many of those who rallied to Mary were Catholics hoping to establish that religion and hoping for the defeat of Protestantism, her supporters also included many for whom her lawful claim to the throne overrode religious considerations. Northumberland was obliged to relinquish control of a nervous council in London, and he marched out of London with 3,000 men, reaching Cambridge the next day. Meanwhile, Mary rallied her forces at Framlingham Castle in Suffolk, gathering an army of nearly 20,000. By the 19th of July, just 9 days after proclaiming Jane as queen, the Privy Council publicly proclaimed Mary as queen. Jane's 9-day reign came to an end, to wild rejoicing throughout London. Stranded in Cambridge, Northumberland himself proclaimed Mary queen, as he had been commanded to do by a letter from the council. Northumberland was arrested and beheaded on 22nd of August, shortly after renouncing Protestantism. His recantation dismayed Jane, who followed him, and her husband, to the scaffold on the 12th of February 1554. Her father Henry Grey, 1st Duke of Suffolk, was also executed for his involvement in Wyatt's rebellion against Mary's marriage proclamation to Catholic Philip of Spain. Queen Mary reversed Edward's Protestant reforms during her reign, and in 1554 she defiantly married Philip, who would in 1587, as King of Spain, send the Armada against his former sister-in-law, Queen Elizabeth. 1936, Edward VIII was king for 326 days. In a vastly changing post-war world and intense political extremes, King George V, the Sailor King, son and successor to Edward VII and grandson of Queen Victoria, reigned for 26 years. He served in the Royal Navy until 1892, when the death of his older brother, Prince Albert Victor, who was sometimes informally named as a Ripper suspect, made him heir instead. Because of the First World War, the empires of his first cousins Tsar Nicholas of Russia and Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany fell, while the British Empire expanded to its greatest extent. In 1917, George renamed the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha to the House of Windsor as a result of bitter anti-German public sentiment. In the same year, he refused to save his kinsmen and women, the Romanovs, from the Red Russian communists, by bringing them to Britain, and they were murdered. Biographers have described George as dull because of his conventionality and by temperament a traditionalist who never fully appreciated or approved the revolutionary changes underway in British society. He was a very heavy smoker throughout his life and died on January 20th. George's eldest son Edward VIII succeeded his father, with whom he had a difficult relationship. George famously remarked that he believed that Edward would be the ruin of himself within a year. As Prince of Wales, he engaged in a series of sexual affairs that worried both his father and then Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin. Edward showed impatience with court protocol, and caused concern among politicians by his apparent disregard for established constitutional conventions. Only months into his reign, a constitutional crisis was caused by his proposal to marry Wallis Simpson, an American who had divorced her first husband and was seeking a divorce from her second. The Prime Ministers of Britain and the Dominions opposed the marriage, arguing a divorced woman with two living ex-husbands was politically and socially unacceptable as a prospective queen consort. Additionally, such a marriage would have conflicted with Edward's status as titular head of the Church of England. When it became apparent he could not marry Simpson and remain on the throne, he abdicated. He was succeeded by his younger brother, George VI, the grandfather of our present king, Charles. After his abdication, Edward married Simpson in France in June 1937, after her second divorce became final. Later that year, the couple toured Nazi Germany. He was a Nazi sympathizer. During World War II, Edward was at first stationed with the British military mission to France, but after the fall of France was appointed governor of the Bahamas. His sympathies for Adolf Hitler and the Nazis had been well known amongst elite circles and royalty, but kept secret from the British public, and he and his wife Wallis visited the Führer many times and praised his regime. In 1940 Lord Caldecott wrote a warning to Winston Churchill, who by this point was Prime Minister, that Edward is well known to be pro-Nazi and he may become a centre of intrigue. Churchill threatened Edward with a court-martial if he did not return to British soil. Even privately in the 1960s he remarked to friends about his admiration for Hitler, despite his autobiographical denials. After the war, Edward spent the rest of his life in France. He and Wallis remained married until his death in 1972.